The fire in the old stone fireplace crackled softly as rain tapped against the windows. My grandchildren sat cross-legged on the carpet, wrapped in warm blankets. They had spent the entire evening asking me about the past. Grandma, little Emma whispered, have you ever been really scared? I smiled, but not because the question was funny. No, I said quietly. I wasn't just scared once. I meant fear itself. The room became silent. I've never told anyone this story from beginning to end, not because I wanted to hide it, but because some memories never truly leave you. I leaned back in my chair and stared into the fire. It happened almost 40 years ago. I, I was 28 years old, returning home after a business conference overseas. It was an ordinary afternoon. The airport buzzed with the usual sounds, rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, children laughing, couples saying goodbye. Nothing seemed unusual. If someone had told every passenger in that terminal that only a few hours later they would question everything they believed about themselves, nobody would have believed it. I certainly wouldn't. Our flight was delayed by 20 minutes because of weather farther along the route. People sighed with annoyance. One businessman complained loudly that he would miss an important meeting. A young couple argued over who had forgotten their passports earlier that morning. Two teenagers laughed while filming videos on a small camcorder. An elderly man quietly read a novel near the window. Everyone had plans. Everyone believed tomorrow was guaranteed. That's the strange thing about life. Normal moments often happen only minutes before everything changes forever. Boarding began. The flight attendants smiled warmly as we entered the aircraft. I remember noticing one particular flight attendant. She wasn't pretending to smile. She genuinely cared about every passenger. She helped an old woman place her bag into the overhead compartment. She joked with a nervous child who was flying for the first time. She looked calm. At the time, I didn't realize how important that calmness would become. I found my seat beside the wing. Next to me sat a middle-aged history teacher named David. We introduced ourselves out of simple politeness. Within minutes, we were discussing books, ancient civilizations, and terrible airplane coffee. Neither of us imagined we would soon rely on each other to stay alive. Takeoff was smooth. The city slowly disappeared beneath the clouds. People relaxed. Seatbelts came off. Drinks were served. Some passengers slept. Others worked on laptops. The atmosphere felt almost peaceful. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened. Then there was a sound. Not loud, not explosive, just wrong. It's difficult to describe. When you've flown enough, you recognize the ordinary noises of an airplane. This wasn't one of them. Several passengers looked around. The engines continued humming, but something had changed. The vibration beneath our feet became uneven. David stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. "Did you feel that?" he asked. I nodded. A minute later, the seatbelt sign illuminated. A calm voice from the cockpit asked everyone to return to their seats. The flight attendants moved quickly through the aisle. They smiled. But now, their smiles looked practiced, not fake, professional. The kind of smile someone wears when they don't want others to panic. That's when I realized something important about fear. Fear is contagious, but so is calmness. The passengers watched the crew more than they listened to the captain. If a flight attendant walked confidently, people relaxed. If one of them hesitated for even half a second, dozens of eyes noticed. Human beings constantly read each other's emotions, even without realizing it. Another vibration, stronger this time. A child began crying.
Someone laughed nervously. A businessman rolled his eyes and muttered, "Probably turbulence." Everyone wanted the simplest explanation, because accepting a frightening possibility requires courage. Ignoring it requires almost none. Then the aircraft suddenly dropped. Not for long, just a few terrifying seconds. But every conversation ended instantly. The cabin fell into absolute silence, and in that silence, I heard something far louder than the engines. Hundreds of people trying not to breathe.
The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then someone screamed. The sound spread through the cabin faster than the turbulence itself. Heads turned in every direction as people searched each other's faces for answers. Fear has a strange way of making us believe that someone else must know what's happening. The captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." His voice was calm, almost too calm. It sounded practiced, as if he had repeated those words hundreds of times in training. Somehow, that frightened me even more. Another violent jolt shook the aircraft. A suitcase burst open inside an overhead bin, and clothes spilled into the aisle. Plastic cups rolled across the floor, while a laptop slid from someone's tray table. The businessman, who had complained about missing an important meeting, now gripped the armrest so tightly his hands trembled. Across the aisle, a mother wrapped both arms around her children. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, again and again. I couldn't tell whether she was comforting them or trying to convince herself. David slowly looked at me. "Funny," he said with a weak smile. "This morning I was worried about paperwork." He laughed quietly. "Now I'd trade everything just to walk outside one more time." Fear reorganizes your priorities in seconds. The seatbelt sign flashed once more. Then the oxygen masks dropped. For a single frozen moment, nobody moved. Hundreds of people simply stared at the yellow masks hanging in front of them. Shock always comes before panic. Then everyone reacted at once. Hands reached upward. People struggled with the straps. Some passengers had ignored the safety demonstration before takeoff and now couldn't remember how the masks worked. A flight attendant shouted over the noise, "Put your own mask on first." One man kept trying to help his wife instead of himself until another passenger pulled the mask over his face. Panic doesn't erase intelligence, it erases order. Behind me, someone repeatedly pressed the call button even though every flight attendant was already busy. A young woman unlocked her phone with shaking fingers. "No signal," she whispered. Still, she opened the voice recorder. "If anyone ever finds this..." Her voice broke before she could finish. A teenage boy raised a small camcorder and began filming everything around him. Instead of crying, he watched the disaster through a screen. Years later, I realized that some people survive fear by becoming observers instead of participants. Near the back of the cabin, a man began shouting, "What aren't they telling us?" "We're going to crash." His panic spread almost instantly. Several passengers started crying. Others demanded answers that nobody could give. One elderly gentleman quietly removed his wedding ring and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He kissed a faded photograph of his wife. Across the aisle, an elderly couple never said a word. They simply held hands, tightly, as if 40 years of marriage had prepared them for this exact moment. Not everyone lost control. An elderly nurse calmly helped the frightened woman beside her adjust her oxygen mask. A young firefighter stood just enough to check seatbelts in the nearby rows before sitting down again. Nobody asked him to.
Some people wait for instructions, others become the instructions. The cabin lights flickered. Someone began praying. Within seconds, more voices joined. Different languages, different beliefs. The words weren't the same, but the hope behind them was. Then, something unexpected happened. A little girl, no older than 6, began singing a lullaby. Softly, quietly. Her mother tried to stop her. Nobody else did. For a few precious moments, even the crying became quieter. Sometimes, courage sounds much smaller than fear. David leaned toward the window. I can't see anything. Outside, there were only dark clouds. No horizon, no ground, only gray emptiness. The aircraft suddenly banked hard to the left. People screamed again. A woman in an expensive business suit, who had looked confident throughout the flight, suddenly buried her face in her hands and sobbed uncontrollably. Another passenger reached across the aisle and held the hand of a complete stranger. Neither of them said a single word. They didn't need to. Even the flight attendants could no longer completely hide the fear in their eyes. I noticed one of them take a slow, deep breath before forcing herself to smile at the passengers. Her hands were trembling, but her voice never did. She understood something the rest of us were only beginning to learn. Panic spreads faster than hope. If the crew stayed calm, maybe the passengers could too. Then the captain spoke again. His calm voice remained.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with a serious mechanical emergency. Our crew is preparing for an emergency landing. Please listen carefully to every instruction. The announcement ended. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the engines, the rattling of the cabin, and the quiet sobbing of frightened passengers. Something had changed. The panic hadn't disappeared, it had evolved. People finally understood that screaming would not save them. The flight attendants quickly demonstrated the emergency brace position. Head down, stay down until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. Everyone copied them, some clumsily, some perfectly. Some simply stared ahead, unable to process another instruction. David leaned toward me. If we survive, he said quietly, I'm retiring. For the first time since we met, neither of us smiled. The aircraft suddenly dropped again, this time much farther. The feeling was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just it falling, it felt as if the world itself had disappeared beneath us. Gasps filled the cabin. A little boy cried out, Mom, are we falling? His mother froze. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally, she nodded. A little, she whispered, but we're still together. The little boy wrapped his tiny hand around hers. Somehow, he looked calmer than she did. Across the aisle, the elderly couple closed their eyes together. The businessman, who had spent the flight arguing with everyone, quietly apologized to the stranger beside him. I've been rude all day. The stranger simply nodded. It doesn't matter anymore. In moments like these, people stop pretending. Masks disappear long before the oxygen masks do. Another loud bang echoed through the aircraft. Several passengers screamed. A woman near the front fainted. Without hesitation, the elderly nurse unbuckled herself for only a moment, checked the woman's breathing, then returned to her seat before another crew member firmly instructed everyone to stay strapped in. Even surrounded by danger, some people couldn't stop helping others. The teenage boy was still recording. His hands shook violently now. The camera captured frightened faces, trembling hands, whispered prayers. Then he slowly lowered it. For the first time, he wanted to live the moment instead of recording it. Outside the window, the clouds finally began to break. Far below, I could see land. It looked impossibly distant. The captain spoke one last time. We have one chance. His voice paused. Brace! Every person in the cabin bent forward. The engines roared louder than ever before. The entire aircraft shook as if every bolt and every piece of metal were fighting to stay together. Then, impact. A deafening crash exploded beneath us. The airplane slammed against the ground with incredible force. Luggage burst from the overhead bins. Lights shattered. The cabin filled with dust and smoke. People were thrown violently against their seatbelts. Another impact. Then another. Metal screamed. Glass cracked. For endless seconds, the aircraft skidded across the ground. I remember thinking only one thing. Not, I'm going to die. Just, please let it stop. Finally, everything became still. The engines were silent. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then came the first cry. We're alive! The words spread through the cabin like sunlight after a storm. Some people laughed, others cried. Several simply sat frozen, unable to believe the nightmare had ended. But it wasn't over. Smoke drifted through the cabin. One of the flight attendants shouted with incredible authority, Leave everything behind! Move to the exits! Now! Fear returned immediately. Not the fear of falling anymore, the fear of running out of time. And that's when I saw another side of humanity. Some passengers rushed toward the exits, thinking only of themselves. Others stopped to help strangers who couldn't stand. David grabbed my arm. Stay with me. I nodded. We joined the line, moving toward the emergency exit. Behind us, alarms continued to echo through the broken aircraft. Ahead of us, the emergency door finally opened. Cold air rushed inside. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could smell the earth. Cold air rushed into the cabin. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could smell the earth. Move! Keep moving! The flight attendant shouted. People slid down the emergency evacuation slide, one after another. Some stumbled the moment they reached the ground. Others fell to their knees and kissed the grass without saying a word. David and I reached the exit together. For a brief second, I looked back into the cabin. The airplane that had carried hundreds of strangers only hours earlier now looked like a broken shell. Smoke drifted from one side of the fuselage. The flight attendants were still inside, not because they had nowhere to go, because they refused to leave until every passenger had escaped. That was the moment I understood what real courage looked like. It wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing someone else's safety before your own. When my feet touched the ground, my legs gave way beneath me. I collapsed. The earth felt strangely solid. I pressed my hands into the grass just to remind myself it was real. Around us, people were crying, hugging complete strangers, calling out names, searching for family members. The businessman who had spent the beginning of the flight complaining was helping an elderly passenger walk away from the wreckage. The teenage boy who had recorded everything had stopped filming. Instead, he wrapped his jacket around a little girl who was shivering from shock. The elderly nurse continued moving from person to person, checking for injuries, even though she had a cut across her own forehead. David sat beside me without speaking. Neither of us needed words. In silence, we watched firefighters and emergency vehicles arrive across the field. The flashing lights reflected through the smoke like stars. Hours later, after doctors examined us and investigators began asking questions, someone handed me a blanket and a cup of hot tea. I remember staring at the steam rising from the cup. It was such an ordinary thing, yet it felt like the greatest gift I had ever received. A warm drink, fresh air,
a heartbeat, things I had taken for granted my entire life. In the months that followed, people often asked me the same question. Were you afraid? They expected me to describe the noise, the shaking, the impact. But those weren't the memories that stayed with me. What I remembered most were the people. I remembered the mother who never stopped comforting her children, the firefighter who helped strangers before thinking of himself, the elderly couple who faced death holding hands, the little girl whose song quieted an entire cabin, the flight attendants who smiled even while they were terrified. And I remembered something else. Fear never changes everyone in the same way. Some people become selfish, others become selfless. The emergency didn't create those qualities, it revealed them. Many years have passed since that day. I still fly. Every single time I fasten my seatbelt, I remember that flight. Not with terror, with gratitude. Because surviving taught me something I could never have learned any other way. Life isn't measured by how many ordinary days we expect to have. It's measured by what we choose to do when an extraordinary moment arrives. I looked at my grandchildren sitting quietly in front of the fireplace. None of them had interrupted me. Emma finally broke the silence. Were you brave, Grandma? I smiled softly. No, I was frightened. Everyone was. She frowned. Then why did you survive? I reached over and gently held her hand, because courage isn't about feeling no fear. It's about refusing to let fear make your decisions. The rain outside had stopped. The fire burned lower. My grandchildren sat in thoughtful silence, imagining a story they hoped they would never have to live themselves. I looked at each of them and smiled. Remember this, I said quietly. When life becomes difficult, watch how people treat one another. That'll tell you far more about who they are than all the easy days ever could. No one spoke after that. The room remained silent. But this time, it wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of understanding.